The unexpected rescue. The battlefield was chaos. Smoke filled the air, and the sound of laser fire echoed in every direction. Lieutenant Adrian Klein crouched behind the smoldering remains of a downed vehicle, gripping his plasma rifle tightly. Sweat dripped down his face as he scanned the area for any sign of movement. The alien marauders were relentless, hunting every human they could find in the wasteland that used to be a bustling colony. Adrian's earpiece crackled. Convoy under attack at Sector 12B. Civilians need immediate support. Hostiles closing in. Understood, Adrian replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. He pushed himself to his feet, keeping low as he moved toward the distress signal. His training had taught him to ignore fear and focus on the mission, but even he felt a twinge of doubt. These aliens weren't just soldiers. They were predators. As he approached the convoy, the scene was grim. A small group of humans was huddled behind a damaged transport vehicle, surrounded by a dozen alien marauders. The aliens were tall, insect-like creatures with gleaming exoskeletons and sharp, blade-like appendages. They moved with terrifying precision, cutting down anyone who tried to escape. Adrian didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired, his shots hitting their marks with deadly accuracy. The aliens turned their attention to him, giving the civilians a chance to run. Adrian shouted, "Go! Head for the outpost." Most of the group bolted, but one young woman hesitated. She was small, with dark hair tied back in a braid, and she clutched a small child who was too scared to move. Her wide, determined eyes met Adrian's for a moment before she ducked behind cover. "Move," Adrian barked, firing at the aliens as he ran toward her. He slid into cover beside her, shielding her and the child with his body. The woman looked up at him, her expression calm despite the danger. "We can't leave," she said, her voice steady. "There are others still trapped." Adrian glanced at her, surprised by her composure. "Who are you?" he asked, but there was no time for an answer. Another alien charged toward them, its razor-sharp appendages glinting in the dim light. Adrian fired, taking it down just in time. The woman pointed toward a nearby wreckage. "They're over there. We can't leave them." Adrian hesitated. His orders were to secure the convoy and retreat, but he couldn't ignore her plea. "Stay here," he said firmly. "Keep the kid safe." Before she could protest, he dashed toward the wreckage. He found two more survivors, a man with a broken leg and a terrified teenage girl. "Let's go," he shouted, helping them to their feet. As they hobbled toward the transport, Adrian covered them, firing at the marauders who closed in from all sides. By the time they reached the convoy, the situation was dire. The remaining civilians were pinned down, and the aliens were closing in fast. Adrian gritted his teeth and barked orders. "Everyone, get inside the transport. I'll hold them off." The civilians scrambled into the vehicle, but the young woman didn't move. Instead, she grabbed a fallen weapon and joined Adrian, her movements surprisingly fluid for someone who didn't look like a soldier. "You'll die out here alone," she said simply, her voice unwavering. Adrian was too focused to argue. Together, they held off the marauders long enough for the transport to start moving. "Get in," he yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her into the vehicle just as the last alien lunged at them. The door slammed shut, and the transport sped away. Inside, the air was tense. The civilians huddled together, whispering prayers of gratitude. Adrian leaned against the wall, catching his breath. The young woman sat across from him, cradling the child she had saved. "Thanks for the help back there," Adrian said, his voice gruff but sincere. "You've got guts." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I couldn't just stand by." Adrian nodded, but something about her demeanor nagged at him. She wasn't like the other civilians. There was a calmness to her, a sense of control that didn't fit the chaos around them. His eyes drifted to the pendant around her neck, a simple, unassuming design that seemed oddly familiar. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lyra," she replied, her tone even. Before Adrian could press her further, the transport jolted to a stop. The driver called out, "We're at the outpost." Everyone out. As the civilians filed out of the vehicle, Adrian's mind raced. There was something about Lyra that didn't add up. He had seen a lot of strange things in his time as a soldier, but this felt different. He didn't know who she was or why she seemed so out of place, but one thing was certain. This was just the beginning. And whatever secrets Lyra was hiding, Adrian had a feeling they were about to change everything. The hidden past. The outpost was a ghost of its former self. Once a bustling supply hub for the colony, it now lay in ruins, charred walls, broken equipment, and silence thick with memories of what had been. Adrian led the group inside, scanning for threats while his rifle remained ready. The civilians stumbled in behind him, their faces pale and drawn. Lyra walked last, her steps steady, the pendant around her neck catching the faint light of the flickering outpost lamps. Adrian barked orders. "Everyone, find a spot and stay quiet. We don't know if the aliens will track us here." As the civilians huddled in the corners, Adrian leaned against a control panel, his eyes narrowing as he watched Lyra. She moved with a confidence he didn't often see in survivors, assessing exits, glancing over the group, and seemingly calculating something in her head. There was nothing random about her actions, and Adrian's instincts, honed over years of combat, told him she wasn't an ordinary civilian. "Hey," he said, breaking the silence between them. "You've got some moves back there. Where'd you learn to fight like that?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt beside a child who had scraped their knee and started cleaning the wound with a calm efficiency that unnerved him. Finally, she looked up, her eyes sharp but guarded. "You pick up things when you have to survive." Adrian frowned. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Before he could press her, one of the rebels they had rescued, a wiry man named Rin, staggered over, clutching his side where a bandage had soaked through with blood. "Lieutenant," Rin rasped, nodding in deference. "The aliens are hunting anything that moves. They won't stop until we're all dead." Adrian handed him a ration pack. "We'll hold out here for the night. By morning, we move to the main settlement." "That's suicide," Rin said, his voice tinged with desperation. "The roads are crawling with patrols." "It's the only option," Adrian said, but his eyes flicked back to Lyra. She was listening intently, her head tilted as if analyzing every word. He noticed the faintest flicker of recognition in Ren's eyes as he glanced at her. But the man quickly looked away. "Do you two know each other?" Adrian asked, his tone sharpening. Ren hesitated, then shook his head too quickly. "No, never seen her before." Lyra didn't correct him, but Adrian saw the faintest twitch of her jaw. There was something here, a connection he couldn't place. He let it go for now. Hours later, as the group settled into restless sleep, Adrian found Lyra standing alone near a shattered viewport. The night outside was eerily quiet, the stars faint through the haze of smoke and debris. She held her pendant in her hand, turning it over as if searching for answers within its simple design. "What's the story with that?" Adrian asked, nodding at the pendant. She didn't look at him. "It was my mother's." "That's not just jewelry," Adrian said, stepping closer. "That's a royal crest, from the Arcadian colonies." Lyra's hand closed over the pendant, her knuckles tightening. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "The Arcadian colonies were wiped out. Everyone knows that." "Not everyone," Adrian said, watching her carefully. "You're not telling me everything. If you want to survive out here, I need to know who you really are." Lyra turned to face him, her eyes sharp and defiant. "I'm someone trying to stay alive, just like you." Adrian didn't press further, but her words didn't satisfy him. As a soldier, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and every part of him screamed that Lyra was hiding something big, something dangerous. Later that night, Adrian woke to the sound of voices. He moved silently toward the source, finding Rin and Lyra speaking in hushed tones near the back of the outpost. Rin's voice was urgent. "You can't keep this up. If they find out who you are." "They won't," Lyra interrupted, her tone cold and firm. "And neither will you. This isn't just about you." Rin snapped. "You have a responsibility." Lyra grabbed him by the collar, her strength surprising for her size. "Do you think I don't know that? Everything I've done, everything I've sacrificed, has been for them." Adrian stepped into the light, and both of them froze. "For who?" he asked, his rifle slung but ready. "What are you talking about?" Rin took a step back, his face pale. Lyra didn't move, her expression unreadable. "It's nothing," she said. "It doesn't sound like nothing," Adrian said. He locked eyes with her. "If you're putting these people in danger, I need to know." For the first time, Lyra's composure cracked, just slightly. "They're not in danger because of me. They're in danger because the aliens want to finish what they started, erasing every trace of the Arcadian colonies." Adrian's breath caught. He remembered the stories, how the Arcadian colonies had been a beacon of human advancement before they were destroyed in a swift, brutal campaign by the alien marauders. Survivors were few, and their royal line was believed to be extinct. "Your royalty," Adrian said, the pieces falling into place. "You're one of them." Lyra didn't answer, but the look in her eyes was all the confirmation he needed. Adrian felt a weight settle on his chest. If she was telling the truth, then this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous. The ambush. The morning came with an uneasy silence, the kind that made Adrian's gut tighten. The outpost walls seemed to close in around the group as they prepared to move. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a warning. The civilians were quieter now, the initial relief of survival replaced by the grim realization of what lay ahead. Lyra stood apart from the group, her face unreadable as she adjusted the straps of a salvaged bag. Adrian noticed how her eyes swept the area, marking exits and possible ambush points. She moved like a soldier, but one trained in a way that was almost regal. He shook his head at the thought. He didn't have time for speculation, not with what they were about to face. "We move fast and stay low," Adrian instructed the group, his voice firm but calm. "Stick together. No heroics. The settlement is a half-day's journey through hostile territory. If we run into trouble, follow my lead." The group nodded, their fear palpable. Adrian turned to Lyra. "You stay close to me." "Got it." "I don't need a babysitter," Lyra replied, her tone sharp. But she didn't argue further, falling into step beside him as they left the outpost. The first few hours passed uneventfully, but the tension was unbearable. The barren landscape stretched endlessly, the only cover provided by the occasional outcropping of jagged rocks or a ruined structure. Adrian kept his rifle ready, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Lyra stayed close, her silence more unnerving than comforting. As they approached a narrow ravine, Adrian raised his hand to signal a stop. "Hold up," he whispered. He crouched low, peering into the shadows below. Something wasn't right. The area was too quiet, too still. "What is it?" Lyra asked, crouching beside him. "Ambush," Adrian muttered. "I can feel it." Before she could respond, the attack came. Alien marauders erupted from the cliffs above, their guttural cries echoing through the ravine. Energy bolts rained down, forcing the group to scatter for cover. Adrian's rifle was up in an instant, returning fire with precision. "Take cover," he shouted. "Keep moving." Panic swept through the civilians as they scrambled for safety. Adrian fired in controlled bursts, taking down 2 marauders who had charged too close. He glanced over his shoulder to see Lyra helping an elderly woman who had tripped, dragging her behind a boulder. "Lyra, get down." Adrian barked, but she ignored him. Grabbing a discarded weapon, she turned and fired, her shots hitting their marks with deadly accuracy. Adrian's stomach tightened, She wasn't just good, she was trained. Whoever she was no ordinary civilian. The fight was chaotic. The rebels tried to hold their ground, but the Marauders' numbers were overwhelming. Adrian gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They couldn't win this fight. They needed an escape plan. "Lyra," he shouted, catching her attention. "Do you see that ridge up ahead?" She nodded, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the terrain. "It's defensible, but we'll have to break through their line to get there." "Then that's what we'll do," Adrian said. "Cover me." Without waiting for her response, he surged forward, his rifle blazing. The Marauders focused on him, giving the others a chance to move. Lyra followed close behind, her weapon spitting fire as she covered their flank. They reached the ridge together, dragging the remaining civilians with them. Adrian turned to Lyra, panting, "We hold them here." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. Together, they set up a defensive position, fending off wave after wave of attackers. The ridge provided an advantage, but their ammunition was running low. Adrian knew they couldn't hold out forever. "Adrian," Lyra called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to end this now." "What do you suggest?" he shouted back. Lyra's eyes flicked to a crumbling structure at the edge of the ravine. "If we bring that down, it'll block their path. It'll also bury us if we're not fast enough," Adrian pointed out. "Do you have a better idea?" She shot back, already moving toward the structure. Adrian cursed under his breath, but followed her. Together, they set charges on the weakened supports, working quickly under the cover of the rebels' dwindling fire. The Marauders were closing in, their guttural cries growing louder. "Charges are set," Lyra yelled. "We need to move." The two of them sprinted back toward the ridge as the first explosion rocked the ravine. The structure collapsed in a cascade of rubble, cutting off the Marauders' advance. Dust filled the air, and for a moment, everything was silent. When the dust settled, Adrian looked around. The civilians were huddled together, shaken but alive. Lyra stood at the edge of the ridge, her shoulders tense as she scanned the horizon. Adrian approached her, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Not bad for someone who doesn't need a babysitter. Lyra didn't smile. Instead, she turned to him, her expression serious. "This isn't over. They'll send more." "I know," Adrian said. He hesitated, then added, "Who are you, Lyra?" "Really?" She met his gaze, her eyes unreadable. "I'm someone who knows what's at stake. That's all you need to know." Adrian frowned but didn't press further. The ambush had only deepened the mystery surrounding her. Whoever Lyra was, one thing was clear. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was fighting for something much bigger. And Adrian wasn't sure whether to trust her or fear what she was capable of. Allies and enemies. The makeshift camp at the edge of the canyon was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional murmur of the wind and the distant howls of predators prowling in the night. The survivors had managed to catch their breath after the ambush, but tension hung heavy in the air. Adrian could feel it as he moved among the group, checking on the injured and reinforcing their perimeter. Despite the temporary safety, he knew they weren't out of danger yet. Lyra was off to the side, sitting by a small fire with a faraway look in her eyes. She hadn't said much since they escaped the ambush, but Adrian noticed how the others gravitated toward her. It wasn't just her calm demeanor or her quick thinking. It was something else, an unspoken authority that even he couldn't ignore. "Lieutenant," Wren's voice interrupted Adrian's thoughts. The wiry rebel approached, glancing nervously at Lyra before leaning in closer. "We've got company." "Humans." Adrian's hand instinctively moved to his rifle. "How many?" "4," Wren replied. "Armed. They're coming up the ridge now." Adrian signaled for Wren to follow and headed toward the ridge. Sure enough, 4 figures emerged from the darkness, their weapons held in non-threatening positions. The leader, a burly man with a scar running down the side of his face, raised a hand in greeting. "Easy, soldier," the man said, his voice gravelly. "We're not here to fight." Adrian didn't lower his rifle. "Who are you?" "Name's Holt," the man replied. "We're with the Resistance." Adrian's eyes narrowed. Resistance fighters were a rare breed. Humans who'd refused to flee or surrender when the aliens invaded. They were resourceful, determined, and notoriously untrustworthy. "You got proof of that?" Holt gestured to a patch on his sleeve, a faded emblem of the Earth colony's military, though it could have easily been scavenged. "We've been fighting these bastards for years," he said. "Heard the gunfire earlier and figured you might need some backup." Adrian glanced at Rin, who shrugged. "Your call, Lieutenant." After a tense moment, Adrian lowered his rifle. "Fine. But if you try anything, you won't get a second chance." Holt grinned. "Fair enough." The Resistance fighters blended into the camp quickly, sharing stories of their battles and offering supplies in exchange for food. Adrian watched them closely, his instincts on high alert. Something about Holt didn't sit right with him. The man was too confident, too smooth, and his eyes lingered on Lyra longer than Adrian liked. As the group settled in, Adrian found Lyra sitting by herself, sharpening a blade she had taken from one of the marauders. "What do you think of our new friends?" he asked, sitting down across from her. "They're hiding something," she said without looking up. "But we need them." Adrian frowned. "Need them for what?" "For what's coming," Lyra replied cryptically. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "You know they won't stop hunting us, right? The marauders. They're not just after survivors. They're after me." Adrian had suspected as much, but hearing her say it sent a chill down his spine. "Why you?" Lyra hesitated, her fingers tightening around the blade. "Because of who I am, or who they think I am." "Care to explain that?" Adrian pressed. Before she could answer, Holt approached, his expression serious. "Lieutenant, we've got movement. Alien patrols, heading this way." Adrian was on his feet in an instant. "How many?" "Too many," Holt said grimly. "We can't hold this position. We need to move." Adrian glanced at Lyra, who was already standing, her expression unreadable. "We don't have a choice," she said. "We'll have to trust them." For now. The group packed up quickly, following Holt and his fighters through the rugged terrain. The Resistance fighters seemed to know the area well, leading them through hidden paths and narrow passes that kept them out of sight. But Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded. His suspicions were confirmed when they reached a small clearing surrounded by cliffs. Holt turned to face them, his grin now predatory. "Sorry, folks," he said, raising his weapon. "But this is where our deal ends." The Resistance fighters aimed their rifles at the group, and Adrian cursed under his breath. "You traitorous son of a—" "It's not personal," Holt said with a shrug. "The aliens pay well for people like you. And for her." He nodded toward Lyra, his grin widening. "Well, she's worth a fortune." Adrian moved to shield Lyra, his rifle raised. "You're making a big mistake." Holt chuckled. "Maybe, but it's one I can live with." Before he could give the order to fire, Lyra stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You think you can sell me out to them and walk away?" she said, her voice cold and commanding. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Holt hesitated, clearly taken aback by her tone. "I don't care who you are, lady. You're just a payday to me." "You should care," Lyra said, taking another step forward. "Because when this is over, you'll wish you had." In a blur of motion, she lunged at Holt, disarming him with a precision that left Adrian stunned. Before the other fighters could react, Adrian and Rin opened fire, taking out two of them, while Lyra dealt with the third. Within moments, the ambush was over. Holt lay on the ground, clutching his arm where Lyra had slashed him. You're no ordinary civilian," he gasped. Lyra knelt beside him, her expression icy. "You're right. And if you value your life, you'll tell me everything you know about the Marauders' plans." Holt's eyes widened in fear, and Adrian realized just how dangerous Lyra truly was. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a force to be reckoned with, and whatever her secrets were, they were worth dying for. The betrayal. The air was heavy with tension as the survivors trudged through the rocky canyon, their footsteps muffled by the loose gravel underfoot. Adrian took the lead, scanning the horizon with his rifle at the ready. Lyra was close behind, her expression set in a mask of quiet determination. The others followed in a loose line, their faces drawn and weary. The betrayal by Holt and his resistance fighters had left them shaken, and trust among the group was beginning to fray. Adrian's voice cut through the silence. "We need to keep moving. The marauders won't be far behind." "We've been running for hours," Rin complained, his voice hoarse. "People need rest." Adrian stopped, turning to face the group. "If we stop now, we'll be sitting ducks. You saw what happened back there. They're not just hunting us. They're hunting her." He nodded toward Lyra. All eyes turned to her, and for the first time, doubt flickered in their gazes. The civilians whispered among themselves, their voices filled with unease. "What aren't you telling us?" a man asked, his tone accusatory. "Why are they after you?" Lyra didn't flinch under their scrutiny. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Because I'm the last heir to the Arcadian colonies. The marauders destroyed our world, but they didn't finish the job. Now, they're trying to erase the last piece of what we were." The group erupted into murmurs. Adrian raised a hand, silencing them. "Whether you believe her or not, it doesn't change the fact that they're coming. If you want to survive, you'll follow my lead." The group reluctantly fell back into line, but Adrian could feel the cracks forming. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and he knew it wouldn't take much to shatter what little unity they had left. Hours later, they reached a narrow pass that opened into a sprawling valley. The sight of the open space made Adrian uneasy. It was too exposed, too vulnerable. "We need to be careful," he said, signaling for the group to stay low. This valley could be a kill zone. As they moved cautiously through the valley, Lyra fell into step beside him. "They're scared," she said softly. "And fear makes people dangerous." Adrian glanced at her. "You're not wrong, but we don't have time for hand-holding. If they want to survive, they'll have to keep up." Lyra nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "You're a good leader, Adrian. But even good leaders can't save everyone." Before he could respond, a deafening explosion shattered the silence. The ground shook beneath their feet as a plume of smoke rose from the ridge behind them. Chaos erupted as energy bolts streaked through the air, and marauders swarmed into the valley from all sides. "It's an ambush," Adrian shouted, diving for cover. "Take defensive positions." The group scattered, scrambling for whatever cover they could find. Adrian fired at the advancing marauders, his shots precise and controlled. Lyra was beside him, her movements fluid as she took down one alien after another with a salvaged energy rifle. Amid the chaos, Adrian's earpiece crackled to life. "Lieutenant," Ren's voice came through, panicked and breathless. "The explosives. They knew exactly where we were. Someone tipped them off." Adrian's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we've got a traitor," Ren replied. "Someone in our group sold us out." Adrian's mind raced as he fought to keep the group together. The idea of a traitor among them was almost too much to process, but there was no denying the evidence. The marauders had been too precise, their attack too coordinated. As the battle raged on, Adrian's eyes darted between the group. Everyone looked equally terrified, but terror could be a mask for guilt. His gaze lingered on Rin, who was shouting orders to a few civilians trying to defend themselves. Then on the man who had questioned Lyra earlier, his movements frantic but calculated. And finally, on Lyra herself, her calm determination standing out against the chaos. "Fall back," Adrian shouted, signaling toward a cluster of boulders that offered some cover. "Regroup over there." The group obeyed, retreating under heavy fire. Once they were behind cover, Adrian turned to Rin. "We need answers. Now." Rin shook his head. I don't know who it is, but someone gave them our location. It has to be someone who knew our route. Adrian's eyes swept over the group. Which means it's one of us. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. The civilians looked at one another, suspicion and fear taking hold. Adrian turned to Lyra. What do you think? I think we don't have time for this, she replied, her voice steady. If we don't move, it won't matter who the traitor is. We'll all be dead. She was right, but Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that this betrayal was part of a larger plan. Whoever the traitor was, they weren't just trying to survive. They had a motive, and Adrian intended to find out what it was. The group managed to escape the valley, leaving the marauders behind for now. They found shelter in a small cave hidden among the cliffs, the walls offering a temporary reprieve from the relentless pursuit. As the group settled, Adrian stood watch at the entrance, his thoughts churning. Lyra joined him, her face drawn but resolute. You think it's me, she said quietly, not looking at him. Adrian didn't deny it. I don't know what to think, but someone betrayed us, and until I know who, I can't trust anyone. Lyra turned to him, her eyes blazing. I didn't sell us out, Adrian. I'm trying to keep these people alive. Whether you believe me or not, that's the truth. Adrian held her gaze, searching for any sign of deception. He found none, but the doubt lingered. If it's not you, then who is it? Lyra's jaw tightened. That's what we need to find out, before it's too late. The final stand. The cave provided a fragile sanctuary, but the weight of their losses and the growing mistrust hung like a storm cloud over the group. Adrian leaned against the cold rock wall, scanning the dark expanse beyond the entrance. His rifle rested against his chest, ready for action. They had bought some time, but not much. The marauders wouldn't give up, and whoever the traitor was, they had surely sent a signal by now. Behind him, the survivors whispered in low voices. Suspicion simmered beneath the surface. Every glance, every word, was laced with doubt. Adrian turned his head slightly, catching snippets of conversation. It has to be her, one of the civilians muttered. Why else would they chase us like this? Maybe it's him, another voice argued. Rin's the one who keeps disappearing. Lyra sat alone near the back of the cave, sharpening her blade with slow, deliberate movements. Her face was a mask of calm, but Adrian could see the tension in her shoulders. She felt the weight of their distrust, but she didn't let it show. Adrian, Rin said, stepping up beside him. We need to talk. Adrian gave a curt nod and followed him to a quieter corner of the cave. What is it? The group is falling apart, Rin said, his voice low. If we don't do something, they'll tear each other apart before the marauders even get here. I know, Adrian replied, his tone grim. But we can't make any moves until we know who the traitor is. Rin hesitated, then leaned in closer. I've been watching them. Holt's men. They knew too much. Someone had to tell them about the ridge, and it wasn't me. But I think I know who it was. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Who? Rin glanced toward the group, his gaze settling on a wiry man named Geralt. He's been too quiet. Doesn't talk much, keeps to himself. And I caught him fiddling with a comms device earlier. Adrian frowned, his instincts warring with Rin's accusation. Geralt was one of the civilians they'd picked up at the outpost, a nervous man who seemed more interested in survival than sabotage. But Rin's words planted a seed of doubt. Keep an eye on him, Adrian said finally, but don't do anything until we're sure. Later that night, Adrian gathered the group for a quiet strategy session. He spread a crude map of the area on the cave floor, marking their current position and possible escape routes. Lyra crouched beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the map. The only way out is through this pass, Adrian said, pointing to a narrow canyon that led to the next settlement. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Risky? Rin snorted. It's suicide. They'll be waiting for us. Do you have a better idea? Adrian snapped, his patience wearing thin. Rin fell silent, but the tension in the room thickened. Lyra broke the silence, her voice calm but commanding. "We don't have a choice. If we stay here, we die. If we move, we have a chance." Geralt, sitting near the edge of the group, shifted uncomfortably. Adrian's eyes flicked to him, noting the way he avoided eye contact. His movements were stiff, his hands fidgeting with a piece of cloth. "Geralt," Adrian said, his voice sharp, "do you have something to add?" The man froze, his eyes darting around the group. "No, nothing." Lyra's gaze locked onto him, her expression unreadable. "Why are you so nervous?" she asked, her tone deceptively soft. "I'm not," Geralt snapped, his voice too loud. "I just want to get out of here alive, same as the rest of you." Before anyone could press him further, the faint hum of engines echoed through the cave. Adrian's heart sank. The marauders had found them. "Positions," he barked, grabbing his rifle. "They're here." The battle was brutal. Marauders poured into the canyon, their energy weapons lighting up the dark. Adrian and the others fought fiercely, using the narrow space to their advantage. Lyra was a whirlwind of precision, her blade flashing as she cut down alien after alien. Amid the chaos, Adrian saw Geralt trying to slip away toward the back of the cave, his gut twisted with realization. "Geralt," he shouted. "Stop." Geralt froze, then bolted. Adrian gave chase, weaving through the melee. He caught up to the man near the cave's exit, tackling him to the ground. A small comms device clattered out of Geralt's pocket. "You sold us out," Adrian growled, pinning him down. "Why?" They promised me safety," Geralt stammered, his face pale with fear. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Adrian said coldly. He grabbed the comms device and smashed it under his boot, then tied Geralt's hands before dragging him back to the group. With Geralt's betrayal exposed, the group rallied together, their anger fueling their resolve. They fought with renewed ferocity, driving the marauders back. Lyra took command, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Push them toward the bottleneck," she shouted. "We can trap them there." Adrian followed her lead, coordinating the defense with precision. Together, they managed to collapse part of the canyon walls, sealing off the entrance and cutting off the marauders' reinforcements. When the dust settled, the survivors were battered but alive. Geralt sat bound near the center of the group, his head bowed in shame. Adrian stood over him, his expression hard. "You almost got us all killed." Lyra stepped forward, her voice icy. "He's not worth our time. We have bigger problems." Adrian nodded, though he couldn't shake the lingering anger. The group was united again, but the scars of betrayal would not fade easily. As the survivors regrouped, Adrian caught Lyra's eye. "You handled yourself well out there." "So did you," she replied. "But this isn't over. The marauders won't stop." Adrian sighed, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. "No, it's not. But we'll be ready." Lyra's gaze hardened. "We have to be. Because the next fight will be even worse. A new beginning." The dawn brought a grim calm to the canyon. The survivors sat huddled around the remnants of a small fire, their faces pale and drawn, yet glimmers of resolve flickered in their eyes. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of burned energy weapons and the dust of collapsed rocks. The marauder ambush had been repelled, but the price of survival weighed on everyone. Adrian stood at the edge of the group, scanning the horizon with weary eyes. His rifle hung loosely at his side, his muscles aching from the brutal fight. He glanced back at the survivors. Only half of them remained from when the journey began. Each loss etched a deeper line into his face, but he knew there was no time to mourn. Not yet. Lyra approached him, her movements quiet and purposeful. She carried herself differently now. There was a confidence, a regal bearing that seemed to demand attention without asking for it. Adrian noticed how the others looked at her, their distrust replaced by a cautious respect. "They'll come again," Adrian said without turning to face her. "They won't stop." "They won't," Lyra agreed. She stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the rising sun. But they'll hesitate. We've shown them that we're not easy prey. Adrian shook his head. They're not afraid of us. Lyra, they're afraid of you. Lyra's expression darkened, but she didn't deny it. Then we used that fear. The group gathered as the morning light grew stronger. Adrian stood at the center, flanked by Lyra and Rin. Geril, bound and silent, sat to the side, his head bowed in shame. Adrian addressed the group, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We made it through the night, but this fight is far from over, he said. The Marauders will regroup, and when they do, they'll come at us with everything they have. We can't stay here. Where do we go? A woman asked, her voice trembling. To the settlement, Lyra answered before Adrian could speak. Her tone was firm, commanding. It's our only chance. There's a resistance network there. If we can reach them, we'll have the resources and manpower to fight back. A murmur spread through the group. The settlement was a beacon of hope, but it was also a dangerous gamble. The path was treacherous, and no one knew how many Marauders stood between them and safety. How do we know they'll take us in? Another man asked. What if it's just another trap? They'll take us in, Lyra said, her voice unwavering. Because of me. Adrian watched the exchange with a mix of admiration and caution. Lyra had grown into her role as a leader, but her growing influence made him uneasy. She carried secrets, dangerous ones, and he wasn't sure where her true loyalties lay. The journey to the settlement was grueling. The survivors moved in tight formation, their nerves on edge with every step. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, the rocky terrain giving way to open plains that offered little cover. Adrian led the group, his rifle ready, while Lyra walked among them, offering quiet words of encouragement. As they neared the outskirts of the settlement, the group encountered a small band of resistance fighters patrolling the area. The fighters raised their weapons, their expressions wary. Hold your fire, Adrian called out, stepping forward with his hands raised. We're not Marauders. We're survivors. One of the fighters, a woman with a scar running down her cheek, narrowed her eyes. Survivors don't make it this far. We're not ordinary survivors, Lyra said, stepping forward. She pulled the pendant from around her neck and held it up. The symbol of the Arcadian colonies gleamed in the sunlight. The fighters froze, their eyes widening. The scared woman lowered her weapon, her expression shifting from suspicion to awe. Is it true? She whispered. Are you? I am, Lyra said simply. And I need your help. The resistance fighters escorted the group into the settlement, a hidden stronghold carved into the side of a mountain. The survivors were given food, medical attention, and a brief moment to breathe. Adrian stayed close to Lyra, watching as she spoke with the resistance leaders. Her presence seemed to galvanize them, her words igniting a spark of hope he hadn't seen in a long time. Later that evening, Adrian confronted her in a quiet corner of the stronghold. You're not just trying to survive, he said. You're building something. What is it? Lyra met his gaze, her expression both wary and resolute. I'm trying to give humanity a chance, she said. The Marauders didn't just destroy the Arcadian colonies. They destroyed our unity, our will to fight. But if we can bring the colonies together, if we can show them that there's still something worth fighting for, we can win. Adrian crossed his arms. And you think they'll follow you because of a pendant? They'll follow me because I'm willing to fight, Lyra said. And because I won't stop until they see that they're stronger together. Adrian studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You're a queen without a crown, Lyra. But maybe that's what we need. As night fell over the settlement, the survivors and resistance fighters gathered in the central hall. Lyra stood at the front, her voice ringing out as she spoke of unity, courage, and defiance. Adrian watched from the sidelines, his doubts slowly giving way to a reluctant sense of hope. In the shadows, a resistance scout approached Adrian. We intercepted a transmission, the scout said grimly. The Marauders are mobilizing. They're coming for us. Adrian's jaw tightened, He looked back at Lyra, who stood tall and unyielding despite the weight of the world on her shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be long and brutal, but for the first time, he believed they had a chance. "She's going to need all the help she can get," Adrian said, "and we'll be ready." As the settlement prepared for the battle to come, Lyra's voice echoed through the hall, a rallying cry for the future. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a queen, and her people were ready to follow her into the fight for humanity's survival.